It's a dire economic crisis made worse by political deadlock. Lebanon is said to be facing an inevitable social explosion. What can be done to prevent the nation collapsing altogether? And who's to blame? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vinell. No food, no water, no medicine and no fuel for transportation or electricity. That's the dire state in which Lebanon finds itself after more than 18 months of political and economic instability. Most analysts put the blame on political sectarianism and corruption. Lebanon's international allies say they want to help the economy, but only after a new government is formed. But that's brought no hope to the millions of Lebanese struggling to make ends meet. The country hasn't had a functioning government in 10 months, and the situation doesn't appear to be getting any better. The World Bank calls Lebanon's economic crisis one of the worst in the world in the last 150 years. The situation is so dire that more than half of its population is now living under the poverty line. Tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs, pushing the unemployment rate to 40%. And those who still have a salary are getting little value for their money. The Lebanese currency has lost more than 90% of its value during the past 18 months. And there's also been a severe shortage of basic goods, including fuel and medicine. Most Lebanese face daily power cuts for many hours, and petrol stations are rationing fuel. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, here's some of what Lebanese people are saying.
The situation is tragic, and nobody in the country cares. None of the officials are listening to us or extending their hands, and that's why the American university is calling on the United Nations, to UNICEF, to the World Health Organization. These conditions are unbearable.
What's happening is unacceptable, especially in Akkar, with the smuggling that's happening 24 hours a day in the suburbs and border areas in front of everyone's eyes. People are desperate. There's no electricity, no generators, no medicine, no life. What are we waiting for? How long will we remain this way? We're all desperate.
You people, pay attention to yourself. You should not use the black market. If you find someone cut off on the road, I would give fuel if I had it and fill it for him for nothing. Not charge him 500,000 Lebanese pounds for fuel. It's a shame.
We are the only ones left. The large bakeries stopped bringing bread to the area, so the pressure is all on us. Due to our small production, we were only given 36 tons. So if the crisis remains, we will not be able to go on for more than 1 week. I don't know what to do. I'm working with everything I have. I'm not hiding a grain of flour.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In Beirut, Patrick Mardini, an economist at Leadenhall International for Market Solutions. In Paris, Joe Macaron, a fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And from Batun in northern Lebanon, Heiko Wimmen, head of the International Crisis Group's Iraq, Syria, Lebanon project. A very warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with you, if I may, Joe Macaron. Most recently, the most recent tragedy to happen in Lebanon, 28 people have just died on Sunday in a fuel tanker explosion, lining up to get fuel which was probably smuggled and then confiscated. The unraveling in Lebanon seems unstoppable. What's your sense of where things are at and where they're heading?
I mean, this is a result of the absence of the state. We still 1 year without the government. We have a gradual collapse in the last few years. Basically accumulation of mismanagement and corruption. And now we see the black market basically taking control over Lebanon, whether the medicine, whether the fuel and energy resources. So we see a government basically that's resigned, that's refusing to take responsibility, and you have political tension, inability to form the government. We are reaching a point of a failed state if we don't reach it already. And we see that every day, that the army is now taking over, even getting involved in how to buy or how to sell the energy sources, which is unprecedented. that the army is already overstretched with security issues, and now we see them taking a more day-to-day managing of the country somehow. So not only it's a little bit of militarized direction, but on the other hand, we have, as I said, we have a collapse of the state, and I'm not sure how it can go from here.
Sure. Heiko, Wimmen, is that your sort of take? Do you agree with that as well? Just on the fuel front, I mean, it's obviously scarce. The fuel subsidy was meant to ease things. Now that's set to end because the central bank can't keep up. I mean, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that I mean, we've reached a critical juncture. The political elite, the people in power, have been really kicking the can down the road for the past 2 years and avoiding the decisions that are required and to get out of this apparently bottomless pit, and they have avoided them, and so we are getting deeper and deeper into that bottomless pit. So I mean, they removed the subsidies, so that no longer there would be an incentive to smuggle fuel to Syria, for instance, and that if people pay like international prices for benzene and diesel, then finally there would be enough of it. But of course, I mean, if we think about what that means, if it really were to happen, it means that as of Monday or Tuesday, if it's really implemented, people will have to pay 4 or 5 times more for benzene, for diesel, and that means simply, I think, a huge part of the Lebanese population cannot afford it. It means a lot of businesses will have to close down because they cannot afford it, and it's yet another turn in the cycle, in the downward spiral towards mass poverty, really.
Let's cross over to Beirut. Patrick Mardini, you're an economist. The central bank says subsidies can continue if the government can pass a law to allow the use of the mandatory reserve. But obviously the country doesn't have a functioning government. So are monetary policymakers being held ransom here?
So actually, I don't think it would be a good idea to continue in the subsidy process. So I don't think it would be a good idea for the government or the parliament to vote a law that allows the use of the required reserve. The tragedy of today, the big explosion that happened in Akkar, and all the fightings that we see every day in the queues lining up at the gas station, all of that is due to subsidies. Subsidies of medicine and fuel led to shortages of medicine and fuel in Lebanon. So even if people today want to work, produce, to get out of the crisis, they cannot do that because of the shortages of gas, which mean that no transportation, and the shortages of fuel means no electricity, and you cannot produce anything without transportation and electricity. So the problem of subsidies is that the government intention was to actually ease the crisis using those subsidies. The unintended consequences of this misguided policy has been catastrophic. It led to bloodshed today, but also it led to basically blocking any possibility of getting back to production and getting out of the current crisis. So I don't think it would be a good idea to continue in the subsidies. I think that subsidies should be repealed immediately.
So what's the alternative then? What's the alternative? If subsidies are to blame, how does one ease the suffering in the short term?
So basically, the first thing we need to do is to cut subsidies, to repeal them. And the government did not do that yet. Today, the prices of fuel are still at the subsidized level, and that's why we still have shortages. If tomorrow morning the government issues the new prices of fuel and those new prices are not subsidized, then the crisis, the fuel crisis, will end immediately, right? So the first thing would be to ensure the availability of those goods in the market, those fuel, this gas, the diesel to the market by lifting subsidies. On the other hand, we need to allow people to regain some purchasing power. And the reason people have been losing purchasing power is because of expansionary monetary policy. We've been printing lira as crazy in order basically to allow the monetization of debt and deficit. And this is the reason of hyperinflation and currency devaluation. So the solution to help people is to actually strengthen the Lebanese pound because their income is in Lebanese pound. And we can do that by stopping the printing of money. And this is one of the reforms that has been discussed today, which is to actually install a currency board. A currency board is a monetary reform that would strengthen the lira and help people recover some purchasing power.
Okay, can I just ask you on that, and I'm sorry if this question comes across a little simple, but haven't governments all around the world been printing money to get through the coronavirus crisis? What is it? What are the other factors at play in Lebanon that have, caused it to have such a negative impact?
Sure. Well, Lebanon has been in a crisis before the corona pandemic kicks in, right? So we had a negative growth and we have a loss of trust in the currency, in the Lebanese pound, and we had a banking crisis. Other countries don't suffer from those challenges as well. So they have some margin to print money without seeing the direct impact via inflation immediately. In Lebanon, since people did not trust their banking system, well, because the banking system actually collapsed. I mean, they had good reasons not to trust it, right? Printing money meant that people would systematically ditch this money and try to convert it into the more safer and secure US dollar. So in the specific case of Lebanon, since we already had a banking crisis and the government had already defaulted on the payment of Eurobond, so the government is unable to pay back debt, we had a big crisis, and printing money in the middle of this crisis meant systematic hyperinflation and devaluation of the currency.
All right. I want to come back to you, Joe Macaron. There's been no government for, 10 months now, no functioning government. How has that happened?
Well, typically in Lebanon, it takes a while to form a government because there's no mechanism to basically manage those differences in the constitution, and there's no timeline, clear timeline. In addition, there's a very complex relation between the president and former Prime Minister Saad Hariri. And Hariri has the support, basically, or both of them, on and Hariri, have the support of Hezbollah. And they couldn't form this government, and Hezbollah didn't basically back out. And we have also the external dimension, which is the US-Iran rapprochement didn't reach a conclusion that everybody was expected. So I think the election is approaching. Both Hariri and On, they don't feel invested in their presidential deal because they are losing in their base. And we have also a blame game on the collapse and a dysfunctional, inept political class on every level. And this is where I disagree with my colleague. I mean, he rightly speaks about the economic assessment, but we don't have a government. The big issue is who's going to pay for this collapse. Those are the big questions. It's not only a technical issue of removing the subsidies. The removal of the subsidy has to come within a context, the right political, socio-economic context, to avoid further collapse. So you need a government which serves the interests of the people, not their own interests, which is not the case. So any advice on the economic level has no meaning unless we have a government that served, that want to get, we saw it in other places in Greece, and that there was a plan to get out, a reform plan, a big decision that might impact their base, that might impact their own and personal interest or monetary interest, even for the political class, and they don't seem to have this willingness to take those very hard decisions. And this is why they are not forming the government, because there are big questions with the IMF moving forward. How you want to cut the deficit, how you want to pay the collapse. And I don't think they are ready, technically, politically, to take on those decisions.
Okay, Heiko, Wimmen, do you agree with that assessment? What's your take on why the various prime minister designates have been unable to form a viable government?
Yeah, I mostly agree with Joe on this. There has clearly been especially between Aoun and Hariri, a very, very strong personal dimension too, personal acrimony, really. But I think if we think about for a second about the decisions that Joe alluded to, the massive, big decisions that have to be taken. I think we realize that even if tomorrow the current candidate, Mr. Miati, may be able to form a government. Seems like the situation doesn't look as bleak on that front as it used to a few weeks ago. The question is really, I mean, can a new government that may be instated actually take these decisions? Because it means moving against very, very powerful vested interest, and it means paying a high political cost, or major political players agreeing to paying a high political cost. And they're like, a few things you can mention, So the banking system is completely dysfunctional and bankrupt. You have to allocate the losses in the banking systems that may amount to $60 billion, which is about 3 times of the current size of the Lebanese economy. You have to distribute these losses. You have to perhaps restructure the banking system. And that, of course, touches on questions of ownership and about who's paying the price. You have politicians who are linked to the banking sector. There's a huge overlap there. We need an audit of the forensic audit of the central bank. The central bank has to be cleaned up before money comes into the country. Nobody will put, not the IMF and nobody else will put money into the system as long as this is not cleared up.
Yeah, I want to interrupt you there. I want to interrupt you there. I want to ask about the international donors, because you made that point there about money coming in. International donors have pledged to help, contingent on a new government being formed. And I want to put that question to Patrick Mardini. Is that fair? And what difference would that international money make?
Well, it is clear, as your guests have already stated, that it is very hard for the Lebanese to form a government, let alone have this government implement reforms, right? International aid is needed in Lebanon, given the size and the magnitude of the crisis. But the international community have been very wise, telling the policymakers in Lebanon, I won't give you any penny if you don't implement specific reform that could actually help your country. Because in Lebanon, we have received a lot of aid in the past years, in the past decades, I'd say, and a lot of loans, and all this money have been used in an inefficient way, and look where it led us. So this idea of conditioning money to reform, I think it's a very important idea, because even if we have a government that is formed, if the government continues to do the same old policies that led us to collapse, then, it would be, the government won't be very useful. You would need a new government that is willing to engage in hard reforms, and those reforms are today clear. You need to lift subsidies, and it has a political cost because people may not like that. You need to set a currency board, so you need to stop printing money, and some bankers won't like that because they would love to reimburse or their dollar deposit in Lebanese pound, useless Lebanese pound. You need to open some sectors to competition, namely electricity. The government is unable to run the sector, and those are all harsh reforms. Will the government be able to do those reforms if formed? That's the real question.
Okay. Joe Macaron, is there something inherently wrong or perhaps in need of an overhaul about the country's power-sharing structure?
All of it in a very simple way. I think there's inability to manage it. It's a place for corruption on every level. The fuel, the way it's imported, I think the way it was managed. I'm not usually a big fan of privatization, but there's no way to get out of this budget deficit without cutting the electricity budget in the government. So I think this should be top priority moving forward. It's not possible that the Lebanese have to pay the government electricity and the private one. It's not possible. We're in 2021 and there's no basically even 1 hour electricity at this point. The public-private partnership they spoke about for a decade, obviously it's failed because they controlled it somehow. So there's some sort of privatization. I think the government should step away and allow the private sector to have a competition a bit and basically sell it, even at a cheap price. I think at this point, nobody has the luxury. So I don't see a way out of fiscal privatization.
Okay, Heiko, Wimmen, does the public, do you think, have any faith anymore in the political class? And if not, how do they get that confidence back?
Well, I'm perhaps not the best person to speak for the Lebanese public as such, but I think it's quite clear that the leaders have failed their constituents, and we see these like moments of anger and protest and rioting and violence that happen time and again. At the same time, I think also if we are realistic, this country is entering into a vortex of poverty, right? So the latest figures are like 80% of the population are now poor, according to the World Bank, and it's going to get even worse. In this situation, people may loathe those leaders, but they may still be dependent on them to get whatever is left of public services of public resources. And let's not forget, the security situation has also been deteriorating and will continue to deteriorate. So nowadays, soldiers, policemen earn $50, $60 a month, perhaps. Who is going to put his life on the line to guarantee security for that amount of money? So very soon it will also become a criteria for not necessarily trust, but for dependency that people have of a political leader, whether this political leader can ensure physical security in an area. So we are looking at a situation with a steady roads, and the population will rally behind anybody who can replace, even very perfunctorily, those services that the state used to provide.
Okay. Patrick Mardini, I'd like to come back to you. We've been talking about these hard decisions that any future government needs to make. You're advocating for the lifting of subsidies. What short-term impact would that have on people who are suffering? Because according to the United Nations, 77% of households in Lebanon can't afford to buy enough food. Where does that leave those people who are already going hungry?
Absolutely. So the main reason of poverty in Lebanon today is hyperinflation and the currency devaluation, right? That's the real reason of the problem today. And the hyperinflation is due to printing money. That's why we need to do monetary reform to ease the suffering of people and to strengthen the Lebanese pound. Now, about subsidies, today people are unable to find fuel, gas, and medicine at the subsidized price. They are already paying the non-subsidized price at the black market. So we are actually living this situation already. The only difference is that when we lift subsidies, we won't have to go and buy our fuel on the black market, and we are uncertain about the quality of this fuel, and there is physical danger associated to it, as we have seen in Akkar earlier this morning, right? So actually getting those commodities back to the market in a legal way, back to the gas station where they will start competing on serving people instead of kicking people out and then trying to sell them those fuel on the black market. That's what is happening today, right? So basically we should go back to normal, where those normal suppliers of fuel and medicines are able to operate freely. And for the population, the solution, the international community, specifically the French initiative, had some ideas to help the population by installing a currency board in Lebanon, right? And the currency board today is able to reduce the exchange rate to strengthen the lira by like around 50%. So basically you are able to increase the purchasing power of the population by by quite a lot if we do monetary reform. This reform is independent from the fact that subsidies should be lifted in order for people to be able to get back to work.
As you say, a lot of difficult decisions lay ahead. We'll have to leave it there for time. Thank you very much to all of our guests, Patrick Mardini, Joe Macaron and Heiko Wimmen. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vinell, and the entire team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.